In the middle of the 6th century, two travelers entered the court of Emperor Justinian, carrying what appeared to be ordinary walking staffs. Inside them was contraband, not gold, not weapons, not stolen documents. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, the hollow staffs contained silkworm eggs, living pieces of a secret that had kept one of the richest empires on earth dependent on distant traders for generations. Byzantium could conquer cities. It could collect taxes across continents. Its emperors could dress themselves in shimmering silk and cover churches with fabric imported from the East. But they could not make a single thread of it. Somewhere beyond their borders, people knew how to raise the insects, feed them, preserve their eggs, unwind their cocoons, and transform a creature's shelter into cloth light enough to pass through a ring. That knowledge was more valuable than the finished fabric, because a bolt of silk could be sold once. Silkworm eggs could create an industry. But reproducing the secret still required people to feed the worms, heat the cocoons, and perform the labor that imperial histories rarely recorded. When those staffs were opened, an ancient monopoly began to crack. But the secret they carried would not make silk free. It would create new rulers, new workshops, new taxes, and new people whose labor disappeared behind the shine. So how did a thread made by an insect become important enough for empires to smuggle life itself across continents? The silk scarf lies beneath a sheet of glass, folded so precisely that it seems less like clothing than evidence. A customer lifts one corner between two fingers. The fabric bends without resistance. Light moves across its surface, then disappears when the angle changes. A small label names the material, the country of manufacture, and the fashion house. It does not name the animal that made the thread. Silk is not harvested from a flower, combed from an animal's coat, or spun from the stem of a plant. It begins as a liquid protein produced inside the body of a caterpillar. When the silkworm is ready to transform, it releases that material through an opening beneath its mouth and moves its head in repeated patterns, wrapping the filament around itself. The result is a cocoon. To the insect, that cocoon is a sealed chamber. It is protection during the most vulnerable stage of its life, a room built for the transformation from larva to moth. To humans, it became raw material. That change in meaning is the first strange fact in silk's history. The silkworm did not create its thread to cover emperors, decorate temples, or hang in luxury stores. It created the thread to disappear inside it. But a cocoon is not yet cloth. Before silk reaches a loom, someone must raise the worms through their life cycle. Mulberry trees must be cultivated because their leaves provide the primary food for the domesticated silkworm. Eggs must be protected. Newly hatched larvae must be fed. Their trays must be cleaned. Heat, moisture, disease, and timing can determine whether a household finishes the season with baskets of usable cocoons or almost nothing. Then comes the moment that makes the long filament valuable. If the adult moth emerges naturally, it breaks through the cocoon and cuts the continuous fiber into shorter pieces. In conventional cultivated silk production, the pupa is therefore killed with heat before emergence. The cocoons are softened, and a worker searches for loose filament ends, joins several of them together, and guides them onto a reel. What looks like a single silk thread is built from filaments too fine to use alone. Only after reeling, twisting, dyeing, and weaving does the biological shelter begin to resemble the polished surface in the store. By then, nearly every sign of its origin has vanished. The customer sees smoothness, a merchant sees value, a designer sees color and movement, but the cocoon, the mulberry leaves, the feeding trays, and the hands that guided the filament have been removed from the finished image. That disappearance would become one of silk's greatest sources of power. The less distant buyers understood about its production, the more mysterious the fabric appeared. And the more mysterious it appeared, the easier it became to treat silk as something almost supernatural, an object that arrived from somewhere beyond the known world, carrying beauty without revealing the labor required to create it. To understand how an insect's shelter became a language of wealth and authority, we have to return to the communities that first built an entire way of life around the silkworm. The first people to build a world around silk did not begin with a road, a palace, or a merchant caravan. They began with a room full of hungry insects. In Chinese tradition, the discovery of silk is credited to Lei Zhu, the legendary wife of the Yellow Emperor. One version says that a cocoon fell into her hot drink and began to loosen, revealing a filament that stretched farther than anyone expected. Another says she noticed silkworms feeding on mulberry leaves and understood that their cocoons could be unwound. It is a perfect origin story. It is also a legend. There was almost certainly no single afternoon when silk was suddenly invented. Evidence points instead to a process developed across generations in ancient China. As communities learned how to domesticate silkworms, cultivate mulberry trees, preserve eggs, and turn fragile cocoons into reliable thread. That achievement required more than curiosity. It required timing. Silkworm eggs had to hatch when mulberry trees were producing fresh leaves. The larvae ate constantly as they grew, consuming far more than their small bodies seemed capable of holding. A family had to gather leaves, chop or arrange them, clean the feeding trays, remove sick worms, and protect the room from sudden changes in heat and moisture. Listen closely inside such a room, and the work becomes audible. Thousands of silkworms feeding at once can produce a soft, continuous rustling, like rain falling on dry leaves. For the household caring for them, that sound meant the crop was alive. Silence could mean trouble. This was not work that could simply be postponed until morning. If the worms lacked food, became too cold, overheated, or caught disease, months of preparation could disappear before a single usable thread reached a loom. The finished fabric might eventually be worn at court, but its first economy was domestic, seasonal, and intensely vulnerable. Women became central to that economy. They planted and tended mulberry trees, raised the insects, handled the cocoons, reeled the filaments, made thread, and passed techniques through families and apprenticeships. Later, histories often celebrated rulers who wore silk or merchants who carried it. The knowledge that made those journeys possible was frequently preserved in rooms whose workers were never named. Once the cocoons were ready, timing mattered again. Wait too long, and the moth would emerge, breaking the long filament. Act at the right moment, and the cocoon could be softened and carefully unwound. Several filaments were joined because each was too fine to serve as thread alone. The reel turned slowly. A mistake could snap the strand. A successful cocoon could release a filament hundreds of yards long. This was the real transformation. People had not merely found a useful insect. They had reorganized plants, architecture, household labor, seasonal calendars, and inherited knowledge around its life cycle. Silk, therefore, became valuable long before it traveled west. It could serve as clothing, tribute, ceremonial material, and a visible measure of rank. Its shine carried authority because producing it required a concentration of knowledge and labor that few outsiders could reproduce. The secret was never simply that a worm made thread. Anyone could eventually discover that. The deeper secret was how to make millions of fragile lives behave like a dependable industry. And once China could produce a fabric the rest of the world desired, but could not easily copy, the thread began moving beyond the communities that understood it. The road that carried silk westward was never a single road. It was a web of deserts, mountain passes, river valleys, ports, caravan towns, and political borders. A bolt of silk could leave northern China, pass through the hands of several merchants, cross territories ruled by different peoples, and reach the Mediterranean without any one traveler completing the entire journey. The name Silk Road came much later. The people using these routes did not imagine themselves moving along one grand highway between east and west. They were crossing local markets, imperial frontiers, seasonal tracks, and stretches of land where survival depended on wells, guides, pack animals, and agreements with whoever controlled the next passage. One important opening came during the Han Dynasty. In 139 BCE, Emperor Wu sent an official named Zhang Qian westward to seek an alliance against the Xiongnu. His mission was diplomatic, not commercial. He was captured and held for years before eventually reaching regions of Central Asia and returning to China with detailed reports about distant peoples, horses, kingdoms, and markets. Those reports did not create Eurasian trade from nothing. Routes already existed, but they helped the Hun court understand how far those networks reached and what might move through them. Silk became one of the most valuable things entering that system. At an oasis town, a merchant could unfasten a bundle from a camel and spread the cloth across a low table. The buyer might examine the weave, hold it toward the sun, and argue over its weight. A clerk recorded the transaction. A local authority collected a fee. Then the fabric was folded again and attached to another animal moving toward another market. Every exchange added distance between the cloth and the people who had produced it. The journey also changed the fabric itself. Chinese silk traveled west, but foreign designs, dyes, weaving methods, and religious symbols traveled in every direction. Central Asian weavers combined Chinese techniques with Persian animals, Mediterranean forms, and local patterns. A textile made in one region could carry images borrowed from several others. The merchants who managed much of this exchange were often people of Central Asia, including Sogdian communities whose networks stretched across cities and courts. They served as translators, guides, financiers, diplomats, and traders. They did not merely move goods between civilizations, they lived between them. At the western end of the network, silk appeared almost detached from ordinary production. A Roman buyer could stand beneath an oil lamp and lift a thin piece of imported fabric toward the flame. The cloth seemed to hold light inside it. Its price reflected not only the quality of the material, but every border crossed, every tax paid, every animal fed, every risk of theft, and every merchant who had taken a share. What the buyer could not see was the room of mulberry leaves at the beginning. That distance gave silk an unusual power. The fabric was real enough to touch, but its origin remained remote enough to invite fantasy. Writers described distant peoples and strange methods. Merchants protected their sources. Courts used silk to display access to a world beyond their own borders. Yet silk was only one thing moving through these routes. Buddhist teachings traveled into China. Artistic motifs passed between Persia, India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. Glass moved east. Paper-making knowledge eventually moved west. Languages, technologies, medicines, and diseases crossed many of the same corridors. Silk gave the network its later name because it was visible, portable, and exceptionally valuable. But the deeper connection was made by the people who carried, translated, taxed, copied, and transformed what passed through their hands. Silk connected East and West, partly because almost no one understood the whole chain. And for the empires at the end of that chain, dependence on people they could not see eventually became intolerable. For Justinian, the problem was not that silk was unavailable. The problem was that every bolt reminded him of dependence. By the middle of the 6th century, Constantinople stood at the center of an empire that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. Its court used silk to mark rank. Its churches used silk to frame sacred objects. Its merchants could obtain the fabric through long networks reaching eastward. But the empire could not reliably produce the raw material for itself. Imported silk passed through territories and markets Byzantium did not control. Political conflict could interrupt supplies. Middlemen could raise prices. Rival powers could profit from every ceremonial robe displayed in the imperial capital. Justinian did not need another merchant offering finished cloth. He needed the next generation of cloth. According to the Byzantine historian Procopius, travelers who understood sericulture reached the emperor's court during Justinian's reign. They explained that silk did not grow on trees or come from a mysterious eastern plant. It came from insects that could be raised wherever mulberry leaves and the right knowledge were available. The difficulty was carrying them alive. Adult moths were impractical cargo, while larvae required constant feeding throughout the journey. Finished silk could supply a workshop for a season. Viable eggs could reproduce the industry for generations. Eggs were different. They were small, dormant, and capable of carrying an entire production system across a border. In the account repeated for centuries afterward, the travelers concealed silkworm eggs inside hollow walking staffs. Imagine the staffs being opened on a table in Constantinople. What fell out would have looked unimpressive. Tiny objects, easy to mistake for seeds or dust, yet each one contained the possibility of ending an empire's dependence on foreign silk. The eggs were kept warm until they hatched. Mulberry leaves were placed before the larvae. For the first time, workers inside Byzantine territory could begin learning the same sequence that had sustained silk production farther east: feeding, cleaning, protecting, collecting, softening, reeling, and weaving. Byzantine domestic silk production is generally dated to around 553 or 554. The change did not immediately erase imported silk or the merchants who supplied it, nor did it give Byzantine workers a complete copy of every technique developed over centuries in China and Central Asia. Knowledge had to be rebuilt through practice, failure, and adaptation. But the strategic balance had shifted. The travelers had not smuggled a luxury product. They had smuggled reproduction. That distinction changed the meaning of the entire operation. A stolen robe could decorate one ruler. Stolen eggs could feed workshops, supply courts, and create revenue for generations. But independence for the empire did not mean freedom for the people making the fabric. Silk production became closely associated with imperial workshops, court demand, church decoration, taxation, and regulation. The state had every reason to supervise a material that could display authority and generate wealth. Access to high-quality silk remained tied to status. Workshops still depended on disciplined labor. The methods had crossed a frontier, but control simply gathered around a new center. In one room, a worker could place fresh mulberry leaves onto a tray of newly hatched worms. In another, a weaver could build imperial eagles, crosses, hunters, and religious figures into the cloth. The finished textile might enter a palace or cover a sacred relic. The names of the people who raised the insects rarely entered either place. This was the deeper consequence of the hollow staffs. They broke one form of dependence without breaking the logic behind it. Every state that learned to produce silk gained a new reason to guard the insects, regulate the workshops, and control who received the finished cloth. The secret had escaped. The struggle to own it had only spread. Once the knowledge of silk escaped its original boundaries, the struggle did not end. It moved from the insect to the scale, from the scale to the loom, and from the loom to the worker's wage. By the 15th century, Bursa had become one of the great silk cities of the Ottoman world. Raw silk arriving from the northern provinces of Iran passed through its markets on the way toward Mediterranean buyers. Before a European merchant could carry it onward, the material was placed on government-controlled scales, weighed, recorded, and taxed. The scene made the hierarchy visible. A porter carried the bundle. An official controlled the scale. A merchant argued over the price. Somewhere far behind them, other hands had raised the worms and reeled the thread. The people who had created the material were absent, but the state and the market were present at the moment its value was declared. Bursa did more than move raw silk. Its workshops produced elaborate velvets, brocades, and cloth, woven with precious metal for palaces, religious institutions, and foreign markets. Silk could cross a border as thread and leave as an object of imperial display. The city prospered because it controlled a narrow point in the journey, but control of trade was never permanent. Wars between the Ottoman and Safavid empires interrupted the flow of Iranian silk. New sea routes redirected commerce. Political decisions made hundreds of miles away could leave looms waiting for material. Farther west, Lyon became another city built around silk. Its workshops did not resemble the large mechanized factories that would later define industrial labor. Many qanats, as Lyon's silk weavers were known, worked in tall rooms in the Croix-Rousse district, where high ceilings could hold enormous looms. The machine occupied the home. Its wooden frame rose toward the ceiling. Its repeated blows traveled through the walls and floorboards. A family might possess skill, tools, and years of experience, yet still depend on merchants and manufacturers for orders. The merchant controlled access to distant buyers. The weaver received the design and the raw material, completed the cloth, and was paid according to a rate that could fall even when rent and food did not. A worker could technically own a loom while having almost no control over the market that determined whether it would earn anything. In 1831, falling orders and wages pushed Lyon's silk workers toward confrontation. Representatives negotiated a minimum tariff for their work, but manufacturers resisted it. Workshops stopped. Crowds gathered. Barricades rose through the steep streets. One slogan appeared above the workers: "Live by working or die fighting." The revolt drove government forces from parts of Lyon for a brief period. But the workers had seized a city without gaining control of the commercial system that governed their industry. Troops returned. The uprising was suppressed. The conflict returned in 1834. Thousands of workers joined another confrontation, amid continuing disputes over labor, political organization, and state authority. This time, the repression was harsher. For several days in April, soldiers fought through Lyon's streets in what local memory would call a bloody week. The fighting left hundreds dead or wounded. The cloth that left Lyon could appear calm and perfect. Its surface did not show the noise of the loom, the uncertainty of the next order, or the bodies behind a barricade. That was silk's central contradiction. The more refined the final object became, the easier it was to hide the disorder required to produce it. A courtier could wear silk as proof of rank. A church could wrap a sacred relic in it. A merchant could calculate it by weight. But the worker who transformed thread into pattern could remain trapped between extraordinary skill and ordinary insecurity. The silk worker might own the loom and still own almost nothing about the market. And even that market depended on something no merchant, official, or army could fully command. The silkworm could become sick. The greatest threat to Europe's silk industry was not an army, a rival merchant, or a new trade route. It was a disease too small to see. During the 19th century, silkworm farms in southern France began producing disturbing crops. Some worms stopped growing. Others became weak, developed dark spots, or died before forming useful cocoons. Eggs that appeared healthy produced sick larvae the following season. The losses spread through regions whose families depended on sericulture. A household could prepare mulberry trees, clean its rearing room, and care for thousands of worms, only to watch the crop collapse before the cocoons were ready. The failure did not remain inside the farmhouse. Fewer cocoons meant less raw silk for reelers, less thread for weavers, and fewer orders for merchants. By the 1860s, the crisis had become serious enough for the French government to seek scientific help. Louis Pasteur did not arrive as an expert on silkworms. He was a chemist known for studying fermentation and microorganisms. When he traveled to the silk-producing region of the Cevennes in 1865, he entered a world of trays, eggs, moths, cocoons, anxious farmers, and diseases that were still poorly understood. On a table, Pasteur placed diseased material beneath a microscope. The growers waiting nearby did not need a scientific theory. They needed to know which eggs could survive the next season. Pasteur and his collaborators examined moths and eggs for signs associated with pebrine, a disease marked by microscopic corpuscles. They also confronted another destructive condition known as flatchery. The two illnesses did not behave in exactly the same way, and Pasteur's explanations were not flawless, but his work helped establish a practical method. Examine the parent moths, reject contaminated stock, improve cleanliness, and breed only from healthier lines. The solution did not cure every worm. It changed how an industry understood risk. For generations, families had relied on experience, inherited judgment, and careful observation. Now the future of a crop could also depend on a microscope, laboratory procedure, and standardized selection. Silk had pulled modern biology into the rearing room. While France struggled to protect an old industry, Japan was using silk to build a new industrial state. After the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japanese leaders wanted export revenue, foreign machinery, and technical knowledge. Raw silk was already one of the country's most valuable exports, but quality varied, and much production remained dispersed among households and small workshops. The government decided to create a model factory. In 1872, the Tomioka silk mill began operating northwest of Tokyo. Its long brick buildings contained French-designed reeling machinery. The government hired the French specialist Paul Brunat and brought in foreign equipment and technical practices. Japanese women were recruited and trained to operate the machines. Inside the mill, rows of workers sat before basins where cocoons were softened. Filaments rose from the water, joined together, and passed through mechanical reels. Instead of one household working according to its own rhythm, hundreds of operations could now be supervised within the same complex. The factory did not remove skill. A worker still had to recognize a usable cocoon, locate the filament, maintain the correct thread thickness, and respond when strands broke. But the surrounding system had changed. Working hours could be scheduled. Output could be counted. Quality could be compared. Training could be repeated. Techniques could be carried back to other regions. Tomioka was not merely a building full of machines. It was a state project designed to convert biological uncertainty and household knowledge into standardized export production. That transformation brought new opportunities, wages, and technical education. It also brought surveillance, discipline, and a sharper separation between the person performing the work and the authority setting its pace. The silkworm remained at the center. It still needed mulberry leaves. It could still become sick. Its cocoon still had to be handled before the moth emerged. The machine had not replaced the insect. It had reorganized every human being around it. And once silk production could be studied, measured, and expanded at industrial scale, the fiber was ready to leave the palace and the fashion house for an entirely different destination. The battlefield. The same fiber once reserved for emperors eventually became something a pilot trusted with his life. Long before synthetic fabrics dominated military equipment, silk offered a rare combination of strength and low weight. It could be folded into a compact pack, carried into the air, and opened into a canopy large enough to slow a falling human body. On a factory table, the fabric no longer resembled an imperial robe. Long sections of pale silk were cut into panels. Workers guided the material beneath sewing machines, joined the seams, and inspected every line of stitching. A small flaw might remain invisible inside the workshop. Thousands of feet above the ground, it could become fatal. The person sewing the parachute would probably never meet the airman who used it. The airman might never know whose hands had assembled the canopy behind his shoulders, yet their lives became connected through the thread. Military demand transformed silk from a symbol of privilege into a strategic material. Parachutes, powder bags, maps, and other specialized equipment consumed fiber that had once entered Western markets primarily as clothing and decoration. But silk's biological origin also made it vulnerable. It depended on mulberry trees, silkworm crops, skilled processing, international trade, and access to producing regions. During the Second World War, the interruption of Asian silk supplies exposed that weakness with new urgency. Armies needed enormous quantities of material, delivered predictably and manufactured according to uniform standards. A living insect could not easily obey a wartime production schedule. Nylon could. Developed shortly before the war, nylon could be manufactured from industrial chemicals rather than raised through a seasonal agricultural cycle. It was strong, light, and capable of being produced at a scale that silk could not match. Material first promoted through consumer products such as stockings was redirected into parachutes, ropes, netting, and other military equipment. On a workbench, a roll of nylon could sit beside a roll of silk. They might perform similar tasks, but they represented two entirely different worlds. One began with eggs, leaves, larvae, cocoons, weather, disease, and accumulated biological knowledge. The other began in a laboratory and expanded through factories. Nylon did not erase silk immediately. Silk parachutes and other silk equipment remained in service during the transition. But the direction was clear. For tasks requiring huge quantities, reliable specifications, and rapid replacement, synthetic fiber offered something no silkworm could provide. Independence from the insect itself, silk lost much of its strategic importance. It did not lose its cultural power. Instead, the qualities that had become disadvantages in industrial warfare were repackaged as advantages in luxury markets. Silk was difficult to produce. That made it exclusive. Its supply could not be expanded without limits. That made it valuable. Its texture varied with biology and craftsmanship. That made it feel authentic. Nylon defeated silk by being repeatable. Luxury preserved silk by celebrating everything that made it difficult to repeat. At a modern reeling workshop, A worker stands over a basin while softened cocoons turn slowly in the water. She catches several filaments, joins them, and watches the thread climb toward a mechanical reel. The finished silk may later carry the name of a fashion house, a designer, or a distant city. Her name will not appear on the label. Neither will the mulberry grower, the family that raised the worms, or the people who dyed and finished the cloth. The product enters the store with a complete identity. Most of the people who created it do not. The silk scarf is still lying beneath the glass. It is still smooth, still light, still capable of sliding through a hand with almost no resistance. Nothing about its surface has changed. What has changed is what can now be seen inside it. There are mulberry leaves carried into a warm room before sunrise. Thousands of silkworms feeding with a sound like rain. A worker searching steaming water for the loose end of a cocoon. There is a bundle of cloth being weighed in an oasis town, then tied to another animal and carried toward another border. A Roman buyer holding a fabric toward an oil lamp without knowing what creature made it. There are tiny eggs hidden inside a hollow staff. An emperor looking at something almost too small to notice and seeing the future of an industry. There is a government scale in Bursa, a loom shaking the floor of a family home in Lyon. Workers raising barricades because owning the machine had not given them the power to decide what their labor was worth. There is Pasteur leaning over a microscope, while an entire silk-producing region waits for an answer. There are women seated before the reeling machines at Tomioka, turning inherited skill into standardized export production. And there is a parachute opening above a falling pilot, its seams made by someone he will never meet. Silk connected east and west, but not through one road and not through one peaceful exchange. It moved through desire, imitation, taxation, espionage, disease, industrial discipline, and human skill. Every age tried to command the thread differently. Courts used it to display authority. Merchants used it to convert distance into profit. States used it to finance power. Factories used it to measure output. Modern brands use it to sell the feeling that rarity can be effortless. But no silk object is effortless. The effort has simply been pushed backward, away from the store, away from the label, and away from the person touching the finished fabric. So the next time silk passes between your fingers, the question is not only whether it is beautiful, the question is how much work had to disappear before that beauty could seem weightless. Silk may be one of the lightest fabrics in the world. The history inside it is anything but light.